If you happen to watch MTV at any point during the 90s and the early 2000s, you undoubtedly saw how ambitious they were during this era. Where they were once known for being the one-stop shop for all things music, the network would dabble into other entertainment mediums and expand their programming, completely reimagining the idea of what MTV was. It's during this time they launched their first reality TV show, The Real World, in 1992. It became a hit for the network. It ran for 33 seasons and defined the future of their forthcoming shows in the following decades. However, only a year prior, they would launch an animation showcase broadcast known as Liquid Television. This program was one of the first of its kind, giving a spotlight to up-and-coming animated shows, which if you've watched my other videos, I talk about how vital opportunities like this were in order to bring beloved characters and stories to our screens back then. When in particular, Liquid Television is responsible for introducing the world to MTV's first widely successful animated show, which speaks for itself. The show is linked to a lot of greatness, right? It ran for 10 seasons, got a theatrical release film, spawned a spinoff that became a success and a cult classic in its own regard, and even received a few revivals long after its original release. As a result, during the 90s and into the 2000s, MTV continued to launch more animated shows, some reaching the success of a Beavis and Butthead and others not so much, with those later being forgotten or never heard of. Today we go more in depth on some of those cartoons. Before the duo would seal the show, another animated show first appeared on the Liquid Television block. Created by Peter Chung, Æon Flux is an adult animated show centered around the titular character, following her missions as a secret agent who originates from the show's city-state, Monica. Set in a dystopian future, her primary objective is shutting down the operations of another city-state, Renya, as the two nations have been in a war for dominance for years. On its own, the show had a very unique look compared to animation of the time, and definitely stood out amongst MTV's later lineup, with its very accentuated, elongated, and detailed animation style. Something interesting to note, Peter Chung worked on Rugrats for character designs and directed the series pilot, which, looking at both, the Klasky Chupo influence is definitely apparent here. However, Chung decided to move on from Rugrats as he became frustrated by the limitations of the characters. Considering just how graphic Æon Flux gets, it's crazy to see the turnover for both shows, but artistically speaking, it's understandable. Now, the way the show is structured was generally considered confusing for most audiences, even acknowledged by the show's creator, as the first episodes premiered as a 12-minute pilot, later divided into a 6-part serial for Liquid Television in 1991, then 5 additional short episodes in 1992, before getting a full season with half-hour episodes in 1995. Continuity-wise, all the episodes that came before the official season were hard to follow off the initial watch, as they all seemed like one-off stories. In the pilot episode, the main character dies at the end, in what feels like the most anticlimactic way possible, falling off a building because a thumbtack was stuck in her foot. For Chung, this pilot was meant to be the end-all be-all for this character, but once MTV renewed Liquid Television for another season, they greenlit Chung for more episodes of Æon Flux, with those batches of episodes now having the main character die at the end of each one. Also, keep in mind, all these preceding episodes are told with almost no dialogue from characters. Fast forward to the official season of the show, and there is finally an easier storyline to follow, along with active dialogue for all characters involved, but still no explanation to the events that happened prior. The truth is, Chung didn't intend for the series to have any sense of continuity. The original intention for the show was based on circumstances. It got aired on a programming block full of short animations that catered to the attention spans of younger audiences, so it was treated as such. Though, just for my own sake, my headcanon was that every episode after the pilot where we see Æon die were actually clones of the original, and every time one dies, another one is sent out. There's an episode in the official season where we see the concept of clones actually brought up, so it's not completely out of the question. It's not factual nor indefinite and probably inconsistent, but it's good enough for me. While the show was considered very successful at the time, I feel like it doesn't get brung up enough in the adult animation talks nowadays, which is so odd because, again, for a Western animated show, the style stands out a lot, and the fact that it came from MTV is a crazy starting point. Also, come to find out they made a theatrical film based on the show, and looking at it, who is that? I know that's not supposed to be the main character. So, in 2005, the Æon Flux movie released under Paramount Pictures and was unfortunately, but not surprising, a box office failure. The movie couldn't even break even making their budget back, and you could tell as audiences and critics did not care for the film in the slightest. A lot of their comments are summed up to something along the lines of, this film did not live up to the show it's based on, looks nothing like it, has terrible pacing, and lacks excitement, which, to be real, I didn't have to sit through an hour and 30 minutes just to tell you that. There was a DVD box set of the full series released the same year, but unfortunately after the failure of the movie, nothing else came from Æon Flux. It's one of those shows that for the short time it was here, broke the barriers of what animation could look like. And honestly, I wouldn't be mad if they made another one-off special for the series just to see how it looked today. Moving on to other animated shows that first appeared on Liquid Television was another darker toned, gruesome show known as The Maxx. Created by Sam Keith, the show is based on his comic book series published by Image Comics. The show's creator had built a pretty good career for himself in comics, working under a few series throughout the 80s before getting to draw an issue for The Incredible Hulk with Marvel. However, in 1993, he left Marvel to pursue publishing his own series with Image Comics. This series follows the adventures of the titular character across two different realities, one being the real world and the other being an alternate world referred to as the Outback. In the real world, Maxx is homeless, living in a box in some dark alleyway. In the Outback, he serves as the protector of a woman known as the Jungle Queen, who also has a real world life known as Julie Winters. It's an interesting concept, and yes, despite Max's appearance, he is meant to be the protagonist in the story. It really shouldn't come as a surprise that this is another gritty show. That was the bulk of the 90s, but I gotta give props to the style. After looking at a few pages of the actual comics, compared to the show, it's like they quite literally brought it to life. I was honestly expecting MTV to give the show a limited budget, resulting in the show being executed in still images and essentially being a colorized animatic. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that. I think it would have looked good regardless. The art is tough, but I'm actually impressed with how fluid the animation is at times and how consistent they are with the scenery. The contrast between worlds is very apparent, as in the real world, the setting is what looks like their take on New York, consisting of a lot of shadows and gloomier colors, while the Outback is much brighter and mainly takes place during the day in some outskirt fields. I also expected that this show was more action heavy, as that was my first impression of the series cover art, but nah, it has one or two episodes that have some battles and fast-paced sequences, but its main focus is on the personal struggles of the characters and their dialogue. And I also like the way they did the dynamic between Maxx and the girl he protects, Julie, throughout the show. See, Julie has been living in the city for a while and has said herself that she hasn't had any good sleep in days. That wasn't until Maxx came along. But Maxx is always getting in trouble with the law, needing Julie to bail him out of jail like every other day or so. They're both very codependent of one another, but their relationship ultimately didn't work out. Julie decides to leave the city, but Maxx doesn't want her to go, feeling like he'd lose the only person that cares about him. Honestly, there's a lot of loose ends by the end of the show, but it makes sense as the comic wasn't finished by this point. Plus, the show is pretty short, with the runtime being 10 minutes across 13 episodes. Still, they managed to tackle a lot of mental health and depression for the people introduced in this show. Outside of Maxx and Julie, we meet a high schooler named Sarah who's coping with the passing of her father. It's some heavy stuff. Maxx is portrayed to be a superhero in the show, but he's definitely washed up and constantly trying to relive any glory days he had. The show constantly makes fun of him for being in purple spandex, and you could tell he's struggling to live life doing something other than what he always did. It's a unique take on superhero life that is almost never explored in those type of stories. I also want to make note that the show's creator would go on to work for DC Comics as well. There he created the limited series Zero Girl, which was published by DC's imprint studio Wildstorm Productions in 2001. It's likely because of this connection that the Maxx and Batman would go on to have an entire comic dedicated to their crossover back in 2022. Overall, I was pretty surprised by a lot of aspects from this show, and it's something else I'd like to see brought back for a modern audience. Now, out of all these obscure shows, this happens to be one of the few I actually knew about and loved way before I decided to do this video. Downtown was yet another show that seemed like it was gone before anyone had the chance to notice it was there. The short-lived series aired on MTV from August 3rd to November 8th of 1999, with nothing to be heard from it for nearly 20 years since its launch. That wouldn't be until episodes of the entire show were uploaded across the internet in the 2010s, with the remastered version being just posted in March of this year. With these re-uploads, the show garnered a fan base across social media. There were those who watched the show back when it first aired, and younger generations like Gen Z who naturally gravitated towards the show as part of their appreciation for the late 90s and early 2000s. Created by Chris Parnowski, the show centers around a diverse group of young adults living in the urban parts of New York. Each episode focuses on their daily lives as characters go on small adventures, tackle adult responsibilities, and deal with the complexities of being in and out of relationships. A lot of the plot lines are based on real stories from interviews done by real people. Even how the characters interact with each other on the show, it's done in a very natural way that sounds like real conversations that people in that age would have. While it's nothing like the graphic scientific, action-packed, or superhero premise we've already talked about today. It's so down to earth that it undoubtedly gives audiences a breath of fresh air. Special props to Chris Parnowski, as his credentials in other animated projects are insane. For MTV, he worked on shows like Daria and Beavis and Butthead, and a lot of the other shows talked about in this video. He's worked for Comedy Central, Nickelodeon, and CBS. Today, he is the head and founder of the very prominent animation production company, Titmouse, which I'm sure you know is behind a lot of quality animation. What's really cool about his bio for Titmouse's website is that he still mentions Downtown as part of his credentials, which makes sense as for one, it was his own creation, but it was also Emmy nominated, which is crazy. Speaking of, as far as the show's look, it definitely reflects the 90s trend of rebellious, grunge aesthetics. The colors are more dulled, while the outlines are thickened and sketchy. The show is said to be influenced by underground comics and alternative culture. Ultimately, it's very much a product of its time, which, believe it or not, was exactly what the creator was going for. Inspiration for the show's execution, interestingly enough, came from Parnowski's admiration for well-known animator and filmmaker Ralph Bakshi for his albeit questionable filmography of the 1970s. In an interview, he said, "When I was in the mid-90s watching Ralph Bakshi films from the early 70s, they felt so much like a time capsule. I was like, I want to make Downtown so that when people watch it 20 years from now, it feels exactly like 1999 in New York. It was made before cell phones were really in the mix. It was just businessmen who had them." That was kind of a line of demarcation where society changed completely. I wanted to be able to have nostalgia for what doesn't exist now. Like I said, Gen Z loves media from that time period, and millennials and Gen X, who I'm sure grew up watching it, can relate to the nostalgia aspect of seeing the show come back up. But apart from that nostalgia, the show's ability to have an accurate piece of early adult life is something I think resonated with a lot of people as well. One of the characters, Alex, who's 24, struggles to keep up with things like his new apartment, his love life, and finding purpose career-wise. Things that you're seeing a lot of the young generation struggle with today. And those are just his problems. You get to know the rest of the other cast, and for one, he's definitely the least interesting in comparison, but all of their stories are enjoyable and very relatable. Again, the full series is available to watch across the internet. Just type it up. They got a remastered version on YouTube, so it's up to you where you want to watch. Now, despite some of the darker cartoons we've been covering, that wasn't all of what MTV had to offer. You of course had more lighthearted shows with a direct focus on dialogue such as Daria and, as we just discussed, Downtown. But these shows have a much simpler premise, and while it's not to their detriment, they're pretty realistic, with a lot of the character interactions and stories being based around events that can and have likely happened in real life. Well, for this show, its premise is more fictional, making it another standout amongst peers of the time. Spy Groove was created by Michael Gans, Richard Register, and Kevin Thompson for MTV, premiering in the summer of 2000. The show is about secret agents quite literally named Agent Number 1 and Agent Number 2, who go out on missions assigned from their boss, Helena Troy. Every episode consists of the agents tackling a new objective in a new location somewhere around the world, thwarting the plans of that episode's villain of the week. With this setup, it does introduce a wide variety of scenery, colors, and characters for the audience to get involved in, but to me, not in a way that feels overwhelming. For every episode, the agents use special gadgets to complete their missions, which is very common for a spy-centered project. There's people who can remember an iconic device from the James Bond films. For me, Spy Kids had the most memorable artillery for that genre when I was growing up. But in my opinion, the gadgets in Spy Groove are pretty forgetful. However, from the first look, you can definitely tell how vibrant the show is. These designs are thanks to the artist Glenn Hansen, who was the art director and designer of the characters and the setting of the show. Everything about the show definitely gives off a retro vibe, with a lot of its aesthetics taking inspiration from 60s to 70s cartoons, which was definitely common for animation in the 2000s, as Clone High most definitely took inspo from the limited 2D motion of 50s cartoons, and that show came out in 2002. So I think this may be one of the first shows from MTV to take that kind of inspiration from way back. I could be wrong though. And the biggest indicator is in the animation, which, while limited in movement, works in its favor. Again, the bulk of the humor on the show comes from the dialogue, as conversations are very fast-paced and play on the setting of each episode. And the voice actors are great. A lot of their banter is hilarious. The character designer Glenn Hansen also had a hand in designing characters for Daria, along with other popular franchises like Monster High, and even provided artwork for one of Blink-182's albums. Honestly, there's not a whole lot of background on this show, but something interesting I was was able to find was according to a blog from animation director David B. Levi, stating that an insider from MTV Animation told him an executive turned down South Park in place of Spy Groove. But it's still a pretty good watch. While I am a fan of action-packed animation, Spy Groove was a nice change of pace, adding yet more diversity to MTV's cartoon catalog at the time. And to its credit, it does have some action sequences, and yes, even some movement from the characters. They're scarce and pretty brief, so if you blink you might miss it, but the flow is very smooth and the style is honestly kind of addictive. At the very least, I would love to see this show remastered in higher quality definition, as the art is too good to be limited to 480p. Like the way every character does not miss the opportunity to grace the screen with a suave pose and locking their face in for a front page photo shoot is hilarious. The outfits are tough, everyone's a diva, it's fabulous. Go ahead and check it out if that's your thing. They got it on YouTube. With this next short-lived series, I feel like this one flew completely under the radar for most people. Station Zero was a daily adult animated live-action hybrid series, much like the other shows that aired for only one season, running from March 8th to April 6th of 1999. The show's premise followed a group of Bronx teenagers who ran a television broadcast show called Live from the Bronx, where they provided commentary on hip-hop music videos. According to IMDb, the show was created by the same team who created A View from the Underground, a comic strip which ran in the source from 1991 to 1994, which all of that was very on par with the time, as hip-hop was the dominating genre, but also reminiscent of the publications that centered around hip-hop news like The Source, Vibe, XXL, and many other magazines. In total, there were 20 episodes. What makes this show a standout is its execution, with it being a commentary of the media surrounding hip-hop. It seemed to give off the vibes of a TRL or better yet 106 in Park. Of course, the bulk of that is speculation, as a large chunk of the show is considered lost media. The only trace of the show is a partial clip of episode 4 uploaded by the user Michael Jones Jr. back in 2019. It's only 8 minutes, and after watching, I think the idea of it is cool, but considering the premise, I can see how MTV were quick to pull the plug. Don't get me wrong, I think how it's done is very ahead of its time. With the use of animation, it does a pretty good job giving the impression of live commentary for the latest videos in hip-hop, and this formula is like those you would see done in other shows like Cedar's World from BET or Maggie from PlayStation Underground, which were instead done with CGI animated host commentators. However, the sad fact is a lot of these type of shows don't last too long, primarily due to cost and ratings. Station Zero was no exception, as after 20 episodes it was canceled. And keep in mind, they already had TRL running up a year prior, which had the same premise but way cheaper to produce and more wide scale with their coverage. Producers speculated the show's demise, and in the series finale, the animated cast eerily walked off into the sunset, being the last time anyone would see anything of this show since. The internet has a crazy way of finding lost media, so I don't think this show is lost forever, or at least I hope that's the case. From the very rare clips that are online, the show looks charming, the characters look cool, I love the art style, so I would like to see this show in full one day. Last but not least, we have the earliest cartoon from MTV's roster and arguably the most underrated. This cartoon debuted in 1987, becoming MTV's first animated series to air on the network. This show almost never gets talked about on a wide scale and seemingly went under the radar for years. Stevie and Zoya is an animated series that consisted of 1-minute interstitials produced by talented animator, artist, and director Joe Horn. Horn would go to work on a ton of other animated projects over the years, including a plethora of Disney property TV shows, some Cartoon Network shows like Class of 3000 and Teen Titans, the 1980s TMNT series, and shows from Fox like The Critic. He also directed a few episodes for The Boondocks. This show itself followed the missions of the titular characters, who are special agents, assigned missions to thwart the plans of any villains by a law enforcement agency known as Daddy-O. There's not much to go off of with this show, as like I've said, its presentation was not only short, but it was a short-lived series, ending in 1989. However, presumably all of the shorts that aired on MTV are available on YouTube. The show definitely has a homemade experimental vibe to it, with a lot of the voice recordings being taken from script reads, and overall the art looks straight out of a sketchbook, with the animation itself being really sporadic and high energy. Watching the show, you could tell it's not trying to take itself seriously at all. The characters don't have any backstory and there's not a lot of context, just pure art. It was really ahead of its time on the storytelling aspect, as you can get this kind of content from some animated story times here on YouTube. And the fact that it was the first showed that it would set the stage for what would come from other shows on MTV down the line. Hell, this show was basically the birth of liquid television. Speaking of, in 1992, Horn would create another animated series for MTV's Liquid TV known as The Specialist. It's another very underrated gem that followed 3 freelance detectives, solving mysteries and putting a stop to a few unique villains in the show. Episodes for that are also on YouTube. What's cool is that since it ended in the late 80s, Horn would produce new episode shorts throughout the years, some from as early as 2004 to as recent as a few days ago under the channel Ace Conrad. It's good to see this kind of art still being created, and you should definitely check it out if you're into it as well. It really is a shame that these shows and many more would only have the chance to be one-offs, being vastly underrated and some being unheard of for years. Unfortunately, any show that didn't reach the same exact success as Beavis and Butthead or its spin-off Daria would unfortunately get cut from airwaves. And everyone knows how expensive animation is, so keep in mind, these shows didn't stand a chance when the network is primarily focused on profit and what can get them the most numbers as opposed to the quality of their lineup and the longevity of their creations. As an animator, when most of the shows you've signed to work on end abruptly, it leaves you out of work and without any chance of revival. One of MTV's last big shows was Clone High back in the early 2000s, and I'm sure you're aware of how annoying the network got with airing reality shows for viewership. And even some of the shows that were successful would get revivals years down the line, but they didn't hit nearly the same or would end up not happening at all. There's plenty of videos that go more in depth on the downfall of MTV, but if you'd like for me to cover those events, I'd love to do so as well. But ultimately, with how experimental and ambitiously creative MTV animation was for the time that it was here, it will forever be remembered by animation fans. The shows mentioned today and so many others have and will continue to inspire the shows of tomorrow. The good thing is, even if they weren't able to get their just due back then, they're able to garner fans across the internet years later.